Hello, East Anchorage Book Club podcast listeners. We are very sad to learn of the death of the great Victor Fisher. Vic was Anchorage's first city planner. We owe Vic for the Delaney Park Strip. He was an Alaska territorial legislator who sponsored the bill that ended the death penalty in our state. He was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention in 1955 and was instrumental in Alaska becoming a state. He founded ISER at the University of Alaska, and he served as an Alaska state senator. He also, as you will learn in today's podcast, was a potential candidate for governor of the region of Chukotka, Russia. Vic was born in 1924 in Berlin to an American father and a Russian mother. He was granted Russian citizenship by Boris Yeltsin after the fall of the Soviet Union. This made the consideration of Vic for governor of Chukotka legitimate. Today's episode's guest, David Ramseur, knew Vic well, and Dave and I will be talking about Vic in the present tense. Today's interview was recorded last week on Alaska Day, which commemorates the date in 1867 when the U.S. purchased Alaska from Russia. But of much greater significance by far is the release of this episode in the immediate wake of the loss of the most important bridge to Russia that this state will ever know. That bridge was Victor Fisher. He was a true Alaskan hero, a true American hero, and he will be deeply missed. We send love to his wife, Jane, and all his family, including his children and grandchildren. Now for today's episode. Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is David Ramseur, who has been a major figure in Alaska politics for over 30 years. He served as press secretary, communications director, chief of staff, and foreign policy advisor to Alaska Governors Steve Cowper and Tony Knowles, and to Anchorage Mayor and U.S. Senator Mark Begich. Today, we are discussing Ramseur's 2017 book, Melting the Ice Curtain. That book tells the story of the courage and persistence of the Alaskan and Russian citizen diplomats who stared down the Cold War to bridge the gap between Alaska and Russia. I think even those of us who live in Alaska forget just how close we are to Russia. At the closest point between Little and Big Diomede Islands, there's 4 kilometers of water between them. That's 2.5 miles. David was inspired by his many visits to the USSR and Russia, including his time living and working there in the early 90s. He began researching this book in earnest in 2015 by interviewing more than 130 key players and examining enormous amounts of archived materials being stored all over the U.S. and Russia. Dave Ramseur, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Tell us a little bit about yourself. Where did you grow up?
I was born on a Marine base in Southern California, and the fact that my dad was a Marine was the defining event of my life because we moved around a lot as a result of his transfers. And I think that gave me both a sense of adventure and a sense of wanderlust. But my dad was mostly stationed in California region, and then I went to 3 different high schools, graduated from a high school in very rural North Carolina, went to college in North Carolina, and then shortly after grad school, had an itch to go somewhere interesting. And a guy that I went to grad school with in Missouri, University of Missouri Journalism School, got his first job in Fairbanks at the News Miner. And so I started corresponding with the News Miner, bugged him for about a year, begging for a job. And finally they said, okay, quit bugging us. Come on up. We'll hire you.
And what year was that?
In 79.
79.
Right.
When you were in college, when you were in grad school, I don't know, when you were in high school, what did you want to be? What did you want to do?
My parents, despite my dad being a Marine and everybody assumes a right-winger, they were moderate Democrats. My grandmother had a picture of John F. Kennedy in her living room, so I was raised with progressive Democratic ties. And so I was always a reader and a decent writer, and I always figured I'd be in politics in some way. And when I was at University of North Carolina, Asheville, in college, I was in student government for 3 years, and my final year decided to try to be editor of the newspaper. I was accepted to that and got hooked on journalism. And so that's where my career went for the first 10 years or so. I worked in South Carolina for a couple of years and then came up to Fairbanks in 79 and worked at the News Miner. And I spent 3 years in Juneau, 2 years in Washington, D.C., working for the News Miner. That's when papers had a lot of resources, could pay for reporters like that. And I got interested in politics and wanted to be on the inside and volunteered on Steve Cooper's gubernatorial campaign in 86. And when he got elected, he asked me to be his press secretary. And Then I went to the dark side and worked in politics for 25 years.
I think for folks who aren't intimately acquainted with politics, they think of the politicians as being the engines. But I think it doesn't take much to realize how important staff are. You were staff for Governor Cooper. You were staff for Mayor Begich. You were staff for Senator Begich.
Governor Knowles.
Governor Knowles. Did you understand how important the staff was when you first started working for Governor Cooper?
Probably not originally. I had a bit of a different role with Cooper, even though I was the press secretary. I worked on the campaign for about a year with little pay, and the only benefit was that I frequently got to travel with the governor or with the candidate. So we got to be pretty good buddies, and when he got elected, I was both kind of his body man, where I traveled with him most of the time, and press secretary as well. We had that relationship. And it was different than the relationship I had both with Tony Knowles and Mark Begich. I was friends with them, but it was more a professional relationship. But yeah, I was clearly knowledgeable of how important staff was. And it depends on the style of the politician, who they bring in. If they're trusted advisors from way back, which was Cooper's case, Knowles tended to hire more sort of professional government people, and Mark Begich did the same.
Did you show up to work on the Cooper campaign with a vast knowledge of Russia already?
No, a little bit of interest in Russia. This was in '86, and Gorbachev was just starting to come to power. And by the time Cooper got elected, Russia started opening up because Gorbachev was trying to be a part of the world and not just part of the Soviet Union. And in 1988, there was what's called the Friendship Flight. Alaska Airlines flew a flight from Nome to Providenia, Russia, with primarily Alaska Native people who had been long separated from relatives on the Russian side. Some of the people on the flight had been in Russia 40 years earlier and had left relatives there and hadn't seen them because of the Cold War. And so that's when Russia started opening up, and that's when Alaska and Russia relations really took off in '88.
I'm just going to mention that I think of myself as being fairly well educated and being very interested in European history. I had to reference your map of the Russian Far East 50 times while reading the book. We live in Alaska. I don't know that like you just said Providenia, which is the closest city to Alaska. 4,000 people. It's not very big.
Yeah.
But then and I'll probably say them wrong, so you can correct me, but Anadyr, the Petropavlovsk,
Kamchatsky.
Yes. And then Magadan. And then the one that everyone knows is Vladivostok. Right. But that's practically in North Korea. It's so far down. And that's the one we think of. But there's all these other cities that are so much closer to Alaska that I think a lot of our listeners probably haven't even heard of, much less could find on a map.
And a lot of this is purposeful, the ignorance that Americans and Russians have, because most of this is closed area in Russia, or at least it was during the Cold War. There's a lot of nuclear weapons in that part of Russia, and Russia was very paranoid about the U.S. invading from the east. And so maps that people in Alaska had in the early days were drawn by the KGB, and so they are intentionally deceptive, and they had cities and airports in actually different locations than they really were. So there was a lot of that sort of cloak and dagger stuff that we see on TV, but there was some of that in reality.
And I'll also just point out that it's an enormous amount of land. We think of Alaska as being big, but Siberia is 2.5 times bigger than Alaska.
Yeah, it's enormous. I think Russia has something like 60% of the world's Arctic in it. And so Russia takes the Arctic much more seriously than the United States does.
I want to go way back. You started the book with a history of when Alaska was part of Russia. which was, again, I don't know this stuff. This was really good for me to learn. But it's actually towards the end of the book that you talk about William Seward traveling to Sitka to speak after he's no longer serving in government, and about how proud he was of the Alaska Purchase. And to someone like me, an average person, all we hear about is Seward's folly and him being ridiculed for the purchase. So I was surprised. He brought his son with him. He was like basically showing his son his greatest work. Can you talk a little bit about William Seward and what he thought of the Alaska Purchase?
Yeah, the proposed purchase was derided in Congress and in the East Coast part of the United States. Nobody knew where Alaska was or anything about it. You had Seward's Folly and the Seward's Icebox and all those names. But Seward himself was an expansionist, and he foresaw that if the United States had some closer relationship to Asia, it would advance the country in a big way. And I think that's part of his motivation for wanting to purchase Alaska. We got a good deal out of the Russians. They needed cash because of the Crimean War, and so they sold Alaska pretty cheap. But I think Seward was really a visionary in foreseeing how the world would change. And after he left Lincoln's cabinet, he did this kind of West Coast tour and came through Alaska, Sitka, and then went down south with his son, as you said, and basically did an adventure. He wanted to see what it was actually like. He had never been to Alaska during his time in service and when the U.S. bought the territory.
And from the time of the purchase until about World War II, there wasn't an ice curtain, so to speak.
Correct.
Can you talk a little bit about the amount of travel between Russia and Alaska prior to World War II?
Yeah, for thousands of years before the purchase, Alaska natives and Russian natives traveled back and forth across what we know as the Bering Strait. It's only 55 miles at the closest point, mainland to mainland, and the Diomede Islands are only 2.5 miles apart from each other. And in the summertime, there was just regular traffic back and forth. A lot of Alaska natives lived on the Russian side, had relatives over there, and vice versa. And then after World War II, when the United States and Russia were allies, remember the Lend-Lease flights from Fairbanks across the Bering Strait into Russia. But after World War II, there was a split, and both sides got very paranoid. Stalin thought that the United States was going to try to take over Russia, perhaps coming from the East Coast. And people in the United States, like J. Edgar Hoover, who was the FBI director at the time, got very paranoid about Russia, too. What had happened is right after the war, there was an agreement to allow continued visitation between Native people, and there was an actual kind of treaty or an agreement between the two countries. But when the Soviet Union started building military bases on the Russian side along the coast, the United States got very paranoid and suspended that treaty and said no more travel between indigenous people across the Bering Strait. So that happened in 1948. The result was just overnight, you had families that were isolated and stranded on either side of the strait. And that lasted really for 40 years, from 48 until 1988, when the friendship flight took place.
Although you do mention in the book that there were occasional folks who accidentally or purposefully went across. It's 2.5 miles. And there's a lot of focus in the book about Russia basically, or Soviet Union, evacuated Big Diomede. And it was just a military base with 70 soldiers or whatever. But so you're not going to have Russian natives leaving Big Diomede and coming to Little Diomede because there weren't any there.
Correct. There was still attempts at isolated travel despite the ban. You're right. There were a couple of native villages on Russian Big Diomede. And after World War II, at the height of the Cold War, the Soviets said, you guys all have to move to the mainland. And they forced indigenous groups like Yupiks into villages with other native people, and they forced them into collectives. And so you might have native people on the Russian side who spoke several native dialects. All of a sudden, they were pushed into these communities and forced to get along with each other and to interact with each other.
That's something that I questioned a lot, the Yupik people in that northeastern part of Russia. I'm assuming that's more like St. Lawrence Island Yupik, which would be unintelligible to the Yupik that we think of as being spoken of in the Kuskokwim Delta.
I think that's right. But even though during the exchange, the native language was used back and forth, and even when the Friendship flight landed in Providencia in 1988, Alaska native indigenous speakers could speak to natives on the other side in
their native language,
whatever the native language was.
I want to talk just a little bit prior to the 1988 Friendship flight. You talked about a few sort of, I guess, olive branch type missions that happened, but the one that really struck me was Lynn Cox swimming from Little Diomede to Big Diomede. I don't know. Can you tell us a little bit about that idea to have someone swim across?
That's pretty crazy. Yeah, there are a whole series of incidents where Alaskans and lower 48 Americans saw that Russia was opening up. And so they came up here because of the proximity to try to see what they could do to put pressure and to try to open things up. People actually saw a lot of potential trade opportunity. Alaska oil and gas companies thought, hey, we haven't been to the Soviet Union ever. There's a lot of potential over there. So there was a lot of interest in opening up Russia, the Soviet Union at the time. But Lynn Cox was this endurance swimmer from California. She had done a lot of cold water, long swims, Catalina Island, swims in Australia. And her dad was a medical doctor, and he used to sit with her and a world map, and he would show her how close Russia and Alaska were. And so she got this idea in her head, why don't I swim between the Diomede Islands? 2.5 miles, not that far. I've swam a lot further than that. So she moved to Nome about a month before the swim, and every day would get up, regardless of the temperature in the spring and summer, and swim up and down the beach in nothing but a bathing suit and goggles and a swim cap. And the water was roughly 36 to 40 degrees. And that's what she trained in.
It's so unbelievable to me. I could not believe that she wasn't wearing a wetsuit. I've Google imaged the swim across the Bering Sea swim that she did. There's no pictures of her in a wetsuit, that she did not wear a wetsuit. It's crazy to me.
There's something about her body chemistry. She writes about this and how her body is different than other people. She's a bit of a chunky gal, so she had the fat cells. But also, for some reason, her body floated on top of the water. And most people, when they swim in cold water, they lose heat. Lynn's chemistry was such that if she swam and continued an even stroke, she gained heat. Her body kept her warm. And she jumped in the water in Little Diomede and sure enough headed for Big Diomede, and about 2 or 3 hours later made it.
Yeah, it wasn't as easy as I think they plotted. And part of it was because there weren't folks going back and forth between the two islands, and actually just figuring out the best course was a challenge. And I don't know, I think that she probably didn't go the most efficient way, and she ended up on some rocks and they had to pull her out.
It's a funny story. There were currents and she was swimming along. She almost gets to Big Diomede, and the Russians made a big deal out of this. They flew something like 100 reporters in from mainland Soviet Union. And they brought in Gorbachev's wife, doctor, to receive her. They had guys in white suits making tea on the beach. They thought it was a great deal.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted national broadcast. She was getting ready to land on the Big Diomede coast, like 100 or 200 yards down from those guys. And they yelled at her, no, don't land here. Swim up to us. So the poor woman's been swimming in ice cold water like that. She had to swim another couple hundred yards and land where all the Soviet entourage was. And when I talked to her about it, she said the thing she remembered most distinctly was she landed on an icy, rocky beach, and she couldn't pull herself out of the water. Mm-hmm. And these 2 Soviet soldiers reached down and grabbed her by the arms and pulled her out. And she remembers the warmth of their hands on her wrists when they pulled her out and sat her down in the snow. Just incredible stuff.
It is a crazy, just really insane story. I guess that gets us, I want to talk about the Friendship flight and what your role was working in Governor Cooper's office. You were his Russia expert.
Yeah, I hardly was an expert on Russia back then. I had an interest in it. But the way the office was organized is we had an international trade office. Nobody was really interested in Russia because we didn't see that there were much prospects for trade. And because of my interest, I spoke into the ear of the governor saying, hey, Russia's opening up. You ought to take advantage of this. And he was a little bit skeptical. He never thought Russia was a big trading partner for Alaska. But when Alaska Airlines pushed for this friendship flight to go across in '88, they invited the head of state, and Cowper headed the delegation. Frank Murkowski was there as a senator. Wally Hickel as a former governor. There are a lot of dignitaries.
I want to interrupt really fast. Speaking of Alaska Airlines, and I guess really my misconception about the whole book is I had been told that the book was about this friendship flight and that we had this ice curtain and that this was an opening. And in my mind, I imagined that this was the one time where we all got together and then nothing happened after and nothing happened before. And that is nothing could be further from the truth because Alaska Airlines was doing flights in 1970 and they marketed themselves as that was their claim to fame. And they had the pictures of the flight attendants being dressed in Russian clothes and bear hats.
Yeah.
Really, your book is about enormous amounts of connection between Northeast Russia and Alaska. And I want to say for our listeners before anyone emails me or whatever, that we are saying Russia over and over again. This whole period, it is the Soviet Union, but this particular era that we're talking about was Russia before, is Russia now.
Correct. Yeah, I think there were a couple of motivating factors in why this area opened up. As I mentioned, the indigenous people, there was a lot of pressure. These people who were on the friendship flight, natives were in their 70s, 80s. They wanted one last opportunity to see long-lost relatives before they passed from the scene. But there was a lot of business interest. Alaska Airlines wanted to resume flights. They envisioned going to Magadan and Khabarovsk and Vladivostok and flying planes loads of tourists over there. And sure enough, that's what they did for about 5 years when they operated. And the oil companies thought that they could get over there and drill for oil and make some money. Alaska's economy was slowing down. And so people were just looking for business opportunities over on the Russian side.
I want, maybe this is the right point in time, to talk about the defectors that kind of may be premature, but I want to talk about them because basically the friendship flight was being organized. It had lots of moving pieces. Were they they came over as they were journalists? They were pretending to be journalists?
Yeah, this was actually a year after the friendship flight. After the friendship flight, it opened the floodgates. There was all kinds of activity back and forth. Russian governors came over here. Governor Cowper went over there for a 10-day trip up and down the Russian Far East. And we had this crazy idea in the governor's office to sign an agreement on the international date line between Big and Little Diomede in the middle of the winter, which was probably a stupid idea, but we dreamed it up in the governor's office. And so the governor from Magadan was able to get to Little Diomede, and we were just going to go out on the ice and sign this agreement in front of the TV cameras. The weather was so bad, Cowper got stranded in Nome, and he couldn't get over there.
So he participated telephonically.
But the Russians...
Who was the governor of Magadan?
A guy named Kobets. The Russians wanted, again, to make a big deal out of this internationally. And there were a couple of, it's a long story. There were a couple of journalists out of Moscow that sort of falsified themselves and argued that they were journalists, ended up going. And on Little Diomede, when everybody was waiting around for the ceremony, these guys pulled a couple of Alaska National Guardsmen aside and said, hey, we want to defect. We want out of the Soviet Union.
And they were successful. Did you interview them?
I did not. I was stuck in Nome with Cowper. I never made it to Little Diomede. I interviewed the National Guardsmen that they defected to, and I actually tried to find them. They were successful. They were brought down to Anchorage. They were granted citizenship in the U.S. They hung around Anchorage for a couple of weeks, were minor celebrities. And then they pretty much disappeared. And I've tried to ask Russian friends to try to find them. I don't know what happened to them.
What was interesting for me as a reader was how angry everyone was that there were defectors.
Right.
Because from my perspective, I would think that Americans would love this, that we're giving these two guys freedom.
but there was a fear that it was going to sabotage the entire melting of the ice curtain, the opening of the border, that this was going to ruin everything.
Yeah, it did rain on the parade for a while. There's a lot of goodwill on both sides ramping up to this thing. And these two guys defect, and it showed the world that the Soviet Union is not all roses as we came to believe under Gorbachev. And so it soured things a bit, and I think it maybe delayed some of the progress, but it ramped up again pretty quickly after these guys disappeared.
So what was interesting is you told that story really well. You talked about one of them having breakfast with his family in Russia that morning, but you didn't interview him about how he had to pretend like he would be back, tell his mother, like, oh, better plan that trip for a month later. You know, a lot of details. How'd you get those details?
There was a lot of press coverage. After these guys defected, they were interviewed extensively by the Alaska press. The Daily News did a huge spread in their, remember they used to have a little weekend magazine, We Alaskans. There was like a 6-page spread in there, and a lot of that came from that point. I can't remember the reporter, but he interviewed these guys when they were in Alaska and got a lot of those sorts of details.
Yeah, it was really interesting. Can we talk about Boris Nemtsov?
Sure.
Who was he?
Boris Nemtsov was a physicist, and in 1993, I was between jobs, by political jobs, and I really had the Russian bug in a bad way. And I wanted to go to Russia and live for a while and try to learn the Russian language. So I went to Vic Fisher, Mr. Russia in Alaska, and said, where should I go? He said, go to Nizhny Novgorod. Never heard of Nizhny Novgorod. It was the third biggest city in Russia, about 100 miles east of Moscow. And it was the most progressive area during the Gorbachev days of glasnost and perestroika. And they were taking Soviet collective shops and turning them into free enterprise shops. There was this famous cheese shop that even Margaret Thatcher at the time went to see this cheese shop. Anyway, the head of all this was a guy named Boris Nemtsov, who was the governor of this region, young, progressive physicist. And he ended up going to Moscow and worked under Yeltsin. And a lot of people thought he was going to be the next prime minister of Russia. He became a dissident when Putin got elected because he disagreed with Putin's policies and was a real thorn in Putin's side. And he was walking across Red Square one evening with his girlfriend, and a van full of Chechens pulled up and put 6 bullets in him and assassinated him on the spot. I knew him a little bit. I drove around with them and hung around with them in Nizhny Novgorod when I was there for 4 months. So it hit me hard, pretty personal. And he had a staff guy who I became buddies with after that, who's now in the slammer in Russia and may not even see the light of day.
I want to talk about both those. One thing I want to say is just to identify for listeners, Vic Fisher. The Vic Fisher we're talking about is the signer of the Alaska State Constitution, territorial legislator, member of the Alaska Constitution Convention.
Correct.
And is the last survivor of the only living signer of the Alaska State Constitution.
And he lived in Russia as a kid.
He did. I did. And we, again, to plug my own podcast, my first interview with Vic Fisher is about his childhood. Yeah. And we talk about him going with his father and his brother and his mother to stand next to Stalin during the May Day parades.
Yeah. Incredible story.
And his father had an affair with Stalin's daughter.
Oh, I actually didn't know that, but
whatever her name was, Svetlana Alinueva. Yes. And Vic Fisher had dinner with his father's girlfriend, who was Stalin's daughter.
Wow. And also had dinner with Eleanor Roosevelt.
Yes, when she rescued his whole family.
Yeah.
Yeah. So little Vic Fisher fan moment, but also Vladimir Kara-Murza, who you just mentioned. This is just one of those coincidences in life. I just listened to an interview with him a few days ago, and then I was cramming your book last night, and he's in the book, but he is in prison. He was a very brave person because traveling the world, speaking out against Putin. It's all important because I think I talked to some people who'd worked with you prior to this interview. I will say, I don't think they've read your book because they said he's a Russian apologist and he is too close to Russia. But in the book, you talk about how it was a major turning point, the assassination of Boris Nemtsov, and how that it did change your outlook.
Oh, dramatically. And Karamazov was an aide to Nemtsov. And when I was working for Senator Begich in D.C., Nemtsov was a regular. He would come testify in front of Congress, and I encouraged Begich to invite him to our office. And so he came and saw us a couple times. I hadn't seen the guy since 93, so it's been almost 30 years. But Karamazov was his right-hand man, a journalist, also a dissident. And after Nemtsov was assassinated, Karamazov took over as one of the leading dissidents in Russia and was poisoned twice by the Russian government, survived both times, and most recently, about a year ago, was picked up and is now in the Gulag for, I think, a 25-year sentence.
Yeah, it's terrible. You're right. He probably will not see the light of day. Going back to Vic Fisher, Vic Fisher served in the Alaska Senate until 86, I believe, and then he lost a very narrow election. But as perestroika was happening, the removal of the ice curtain or the melting of it, there was talk of him going back to Russia to be governor of Chukotka. Can you talk a little bit about that? And it didn't happen, but about the negotiations behind that and what was happening there.
Sure. After Vic left the Senate, he became the first paid person at the University of Alaska to head up their Russian affairs office. He had a little tiny staff, and this is as activity was ramping up between the two. And actually, the university was a leader in trying to melt the ice curtain. Chukotka is the region closest to Alaska, primarily an indigenous region, quite poor. And in the early 90s, the governor then was very regressive and very discriminatory towards the native people there. And people were starving and dying. And so Vic and some of his Alaska advisors thought, how can we help these people? And so they discovered that the governor of Chukotka did not have to could be a dual citizen. And Vic had Russian citizenship. So he thought for a couple months, maybe I can get myself elected of Chukotka, governor of Chukotka, and help these people. As it turns out, one of the wealthiest guys in the world stepped forward, a Russian guy, Abramovich, and said, I will be governor of Chukotka. And he poured a lot of personal money in and actually benefited the region significantly, raised the standard of living, healthcare, education, did a great job. I'm not sure Vic ever wanted to be governor of the region, but he probably would have done a great job. But he helped get this other guy
Abramovich elected, which you mentioned it several times of going, even when you went back years later, folks showing you Abramovich projects, the siding on their homes.
Yeah, these elevated houses he built. He got Canadian infrastructure, Canadian technology to build houses on refrigerated poles like the Alaska pipeline's built on, so these houses wouldn't crumble into the permafrost when the permafrost melted.
What Vic Fisher told me was that he thought he was too old to really pursue it in earnest. He was 70 years old at the time. Of course, his wife said if they knew he was going to live 30 more years, they may have acted differently.
All right.
Yeah.
When it comes to living in Anchorage or in Chukotka, I think Vic made the right decision.
So there was talk around this period of creating an international park, Beringia, that would basically encompass where the Bering Land Bridge would have existed and would be on both sides. I didn't even know there was such a thing as international parks. There was a lot of opposition from Alaska Native groups, from Alaska's federal delegation. Really, it was not a welcome idea. But I'm just curious if you can talk a little bit about that idea and what an international park would have done.
This was an era of goodwill, and people thought, let's celebrate the good relations between the two of us by creating this international park that spans the Bering Strait. So the idea was to identify lands both on the Alaska side and the Russian side that could compose the park. The Russians proceeded, and they took, I forget how many, 6 or 8 various little parks, not all contiguous, but they dedicated them to this international park. But on the American side, you had people like Don Young, our congressman, who said, this is a violation of Alaska's sovereignty. You can't create a national park, an international park here. It may affect mining and oil development, all the things that we want to do. And so it never got traction on the U.S. side.
And you mentioned that there were Alaska Native groups who were opposed because they felt that they had not been a part of the decision-making process, that this was something that was being decided in D.C., that was ignoring the actual people who would be living in the international park.
As we know in Alaska, there's a lot of distaste for the federal National Park Service, and they were the lead agency. One of the good things that did come from this, even though there is not an existing international park, is the National Park Service created something called the Beringia program. And for 20 years, they've been throwing off small chunks of money in the form of grants to promote Alaska-Russia relations. That was suspended when Putin first invaded Ukraine, but to this day, it's going on, and a number of Alaska Native groups have benefited, and it has promoted the cause of better relations between Alaska and Russia.
One thing I wanted to mention when you talked about the university sort of spearheading the good relationships is that, and you can correct me, folks who lived in Northeast Russia could go to college at UAA for in-state tuition.
At the height of all this goodwill, Alaska cities rushed to create sister city relationships on the Russian side. Everybody wanted to be a sister city. So there were actually a dozen sister cities created. Anchorage and Magadan, Nome and Providencia, Juneau, and a part of Vladivostok. The list goes on. So the university adopted a policy that any student from a sister city of Alaska in Russia could attend at in-state tuition rates. And so thousands of Russian students came to UAA, and at one point, UAA had more Russian students than any other university in the country. That lasted for a few years. It cost the university a little bit because they were granting in-state tuition rates, but the idea was that you would promote cultural understanding. A lot of those Russian students who came here learned Western business practices and went back to Russia and put them to work. And so I think it was a beneficial program.
I think you pointed out one of the issues was these folks coming from Russia didn't have money. The ruble wasn't worth very much. And so they couldn't actually, the in-state tuition was one thing, but their living expenses in Alaska were high. Mm-hmm. And so they couldn't afford to live in dorms. So they had to have homestays. And you said that at first that worked out okay, but over time, the homestays dried up.
Really, during this era, Alaskans just thought it was great novelty to talk to a real live Russian. It was such a mysterious thing. And so for years, Aeroflot flights would show up out at Anchorage International Airport full of Rotarians, teachers, journalists, you name the group, wanting to come over here. And everybody did homestays. And for years, people would take these Russians in. They didn't have any money. You'd feed them for a week, drive them around the state, pay all their expenses. After a few years of this, people got tired of it. And when the students started coming over, some of them had tough receptions over here and had to work through some of the business community and other connections.
Between 1993 and 2015, 4,800 Russian natives were able to visit Alaska visa-free.
Correct.
Because that was the program after the friendship flight or whatever, was to create a way for Russian natives to
Russia
and Alaska natives. Yeah, you didn't have the number there, but do you know the number? Like how many Alaska natives took advantage?
I think that was the number for both sides.
Both. Okay.
Yeah. So one of the ideas, one of the permanent programs that came about as a result of all this goodwill was some way for natives to travel back and forth without the hassle of getting a visa from their national governments. If you want to go to Russia, or you wanted to in the 90s, it's a real pain. You got to go to Washington, D.C., or for Russians, they had to go to Vladivostok and get a visa. So the two national governments adopted this policy that people who are natives of the region could travel back and forth without the need for a visa. It's not like getting in a skin boat and just driving across. You've got to get permission. Both sides set up border commissions of a couple of people, and they oversaw this process. But it was a lot easier and a lot cheaper for Native people to travel than for non-Natives.
You went back to Russia in 2016
Right.
and basically visited a lot of the places that you had visited 30 years before. You brought this up that I think, I'm going to generalize, to the average American, you would think that moving from a communist culture to a capitalist one would be great. But you got to visit these villages prior to becoming capitalist.
Right.
So maybe you can talk a little bit about the changes that you observed over that 30-year period.
During the Soviet era, the Soviet national government was trying to increase the population of the Russian Far East and take advantage of resources. And so they put a lot of subsidies into these very remote villages. Providenia at one point had a population of 10,000 people. They had a dairy, a brewery, beer brewery, a bakery. They were growing vegetables in hothouses. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, they didn't have any money for these subsidies. So all that shut down. And a lot of these so-called white Russians, non-native Russians who were living in Ukraine, in Western Russia, left the Far East. Hey, even though when they could make big money under the Soviet system, they couldn't under the new Russian system. So they all moved back to Western Russia. What was left was native people in these villages. And what's happened now is there are no subsidies. And so a lot of these native villages have what I say go back to their subsistence roots. They formed hunting and fishing cooperatives. They pool boats and motors and guns to go out and do subsistence hunting and fishing for the villages. There are very few non-native Russians in a lot of these villages, and they just live on the land, basically. Somewhat like Alaska villages, but with a lot less civilization than some of our villages have.
What's interesting about that part is you guys got arrested. And what I find fascinating is you were off the road system. You were traveling to these extraordinarily remote places. And I think, folks forget Moscow's 11 time zones away.
Correct.
So far away. I was wondering how they afford to have border guards in these random places to ask for your papers.
Part of it is driven by paranoia of the United States, and they still have a pretty healthy border guard system along the coast to guard against any intrusions coming from the West. But in this particular case, the short story is you have to have a special permit to go to Chukotka in addition to the visa to go to Russia. We had our permit, but we took a bus ride for the day and left the permit in the place we were staying in another village. You get to a village, the border guard boards the bus. Where's your special permit? Oh, we left it in the village this morning. Sorry, you are violating federal law. And they held us for 16 hours, paraded us in front of a federal judge. It was a little spooky. One at a time. No, most of us spoke no Russian. Our chairs were pushed up against the steel cage where they put prisoners in federal courthouses. And we were each fined the equivalent of $8, which I think was more of a shakedown than anything else, but it was pretty intimidating, and it was to let us know who was boss.
Even when I read that part that you got paraded in front of a federal judge, I was like, there's a federal judge there?
Yeah. It's in a regional center,
Right.
Dome, where you
Yeah.
have a regional center.
Right. I think moving towards the end of our time, can you talk about what you think of what's happening in Russia today and maybe update us a little bit in the past 5 years since the book came, or 7 years since the
17
book?
it came out,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, it's a terrible tragedy. And I'll respond to something you mentioned. Some critics say I've been a Russian apologist, and I think there is something to that. I've been to Russia more than 15 times. I've lived there for a while. I tried to learn the language, not very successfully. And I've tried to explain to people who don't know Russia what motivates Russian people, what's different about their society. And to some extent, I have been an apologist, but it's gloves off after what Putin's done in Ukraine. It's just a terrible tragedy. That's where Russia started in Ukraine. Kiev's been around a lot longer than either Moscow or St. Petersburg in the history of Russia. And I don't know how it all ends. I take it a little personally because, as we discussed, there are a couple people I know who are in jail there and may never see the light of day and have families and are fighting the good fight. I think the dilemma for Alaskans and Americans generally is, do we continue to interact with Russia? Or, like most of us have done, we want nothing to do with Russia while Putin is still in Ukraine. Most of the sister city relationships that we had established have been either canceled or suspended, which I think is the right thing to do. But I think the thing to keep in mind is that one day Putin will no longer be president of Russia, and we've got to deal with Russia. It's close to us. They've got a lot of nuclear weapons. They know how to operate in the Arctic, and so we got to take Russia seriously. So I think we need to be positioned for that time when Putin is either moved out, passes from the scene, and there's somebody more palatable that we can deal with, because Americans just have to deal with Russia. The world has to deal with Russia.
Speaking of sister cities, Anchorage's sister city was Magadan.
Correct.
Can you talk about why Magadan is famous?
Magadan was the jumping off point in the 40s and 50s for the Gulag system. And when Stalin was there, they would send people either overland or by ships to this remote part of the Russian Far East, and they would land in Magadan. And then they were sent from there into the interior of the Far East or Siberia. Lots of times it's the last time they ever saw an ocean, because they were sent, for 20 years into hard labor in an internal gulag where the winter temperatures were 70 below. And so that's the origin of Magadan.
And when you visited there the first time, you were expecting that they were going to do a dog and pony show, but didn't they take you to a museum, like the Gulag Museum?
They did. During this era, would Gorbachev encourage people to discuss problems with the country, past problems? They established a Gulag Museum, and they had pictures just covering wall after wall of all the people who passed through and never left and died in the gulags. And you can still travel to remnants. It's hard to get there. You have to go by helicopter. There's not very good roads. But there's still a lot of people who went to Magadan as Gulag inmates and decided to stay there.
Gorbachev orchestrated the melting, the thawing of the relationship. And he thought of Boris Yeltsin as his enemy. That's, again, to an American who doesn't pay very close attention, I kind of associate Gorbachev and Yeltsin as being this sort of continuous line, but it wasn't.
Yeah, it's a kind of a long, complicated story, but Gorbachev was president of the Soviet Union, and he was the guy who presided over the demolishment of the Soviet Union. So all the satellites, the Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Ukraine,
Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania.
All those countries peeled off, and what was left was just Russia. So after Gorbachev left office, actually, in part forced out by Yeltsin, Yeltsin became president of just Russia, not Soviet Union, not the Soviet Union.
I guess what I was gearing up for, is there an alternative history where Putin doesn't become president? Was there something else that could have happened in that transition from Gorbachev to Yeltsin to Putin?
Sure. The circumstances are that Yeltsin took over Russia when it was struggling to become a market economy and become a democracy. And it was really tough going because they've had a czarist system for almost 100 years. Yeltsin was a drunk. He was barely alive. He knew he was going to die shortly, and he got this group of advisors together and said, "What do I do?" And they said, "Hey, this guy who's a KGB guy from St. Petersburg might be a good idea." And so that's where Putin came from. And the difference is most Soviet leaders have come through the sort of Soviet political system. They started as the head of the party in their little farm village and worked their way up to the Kremlin. Putin was just snatched by Yeltsin to take over. And so the people he brought with him are loyal to him, not to the system. And so I think that's why it's going to be more difficult to get rid of Putin. Unless somebody just takes him out sometime, which I don't think is likely, he has surrounded himself by people who owe their wealth and their lives to him. So I don't think they're going to push him aside. it's going to be tough to do that.
For the last thing, I wanted to ask you to read just a little bit from the book.
There's a section on page 241, the last 3 paragraphs of the book.
Okay, yeah, let's do that.
Okay.
Well, I will defer to you.
Okay, this is the last few sentences of the book. On my last day in the Russian Far East in the summer of 2016, I was up early, nervous about the flying weather. After 2 fascinating yet frustrating weeks along Russia's remote Bering Sea coast, I was ready for American normalcy. Russia always had this effect. It is irritatingly unpredictable while there, but I'm always eager to return. The low clouds hanging over Providenia had us anxious about missed connections and messed up lives back home. With nothing to do but wait, I headed out into Providenia's dusty streets for a few last-minute photos. On the crumbling concrete steps of the community hall that 28 years earlier had been ground zero for melting the ice curtain, I remembered the elation among the Alaskan and Siberian U.S. who had reconnected after 4 decades. I remembered the enthusiasm of the business leaders who envisioned new markets for Alaska services and new Russian resources ripe for development. And I remembered that, in my own relief, that everyday Soviets were not the red menace of my childhood, but instead pretty much like us. As I stood there feeling glum over the passing of an era of such high expectations, a local Russian rushed up, interrupting my thoughts. And recognizing me as a foreigner, he asked in broken English where I was from. And when I told him Alaska, he pointed at the eastern horizon and with a wide grin gave me a hearty thumbs up.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Thank you. I loved it.
Thank you to you, our listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email eastanchoragebookclub@gmail.com. That's East Anchorage Book Club, all one word, @gmail.com.